Sarah Chen stared at the hospital ceiling, counting the tiny holes in the acoustic tiles above her bed. The morphine drip had stopped working hours ago, but the nurses were too busy to notice her quiet suffering. She had learned not to press the call button too often. The night shift staff moved like ghosts through the corridors, their footsteps echoing against the sterile floors. The accident had happened 3 weeks ago on Highway 95. A drunk driver, running a red light, had crushed her car like a tin can. Her spine was fractured in 2 places, her pelvis shattered, and her left leg held together with more metal than bone. The doctors spoke in hushed tones about permanent disability, about wheelchairs and physical therapy that might never restore what she had lost. But Sarah had something they couldn't measure on their charts or see in their x-rays. She had a will, forged in the fires of a childhood that had taught her to survive against impossible odds. Growing up in foster care had been her first lesson in endurance. Bouncing between homes, sleeping on couches, wearing donated clothes that never quite fit. Those experiences had built something unbreakable inside her. The clock on the wall ticked with mechanical precision. Each second felt like a minute, each minute like an hour. Time had become her enemy and her companion. During the day, visitors came and went. Her adoptive parents, the Johnsons, sat beside her bed with tears in their eyes, holding her hand and whispering prayers. Her best friend Maya brought magazines and tried to make jokes, but laughter hurt too much. The physical therapist came, twice daily, moving her legs in ways that sent lightning bolts of pain through her nervous system. At night, though, Sarah was alone with the clock and her thoughts. The medication made her drowsy but never let her truly sleep. She drifted in and out of consciousness, watching the red digital numbers change on the clock face. 11:47 p.m. became 11:48, then 11:49. Each minute was a small victory, proof that she was still alive, still fighting. The neurologist had explained her condition with cold scientific precision. The damage to her spinal cord was severe but incomplete. She had sensation in her legs, which was encouraging, but the swelling and trauma made it impossible to predict how much function she might regain. He used words like partial recovery and adaptive equipment and realistic expectations. Sarah listened to his words but didn't accept them as final verdicts. She had spent her entire 28 years proving people wrong about what she could accomplish. Born to a teenage mother who disappeared when Sarah was 2, she had been labeled difficult by social workers who moved her from home to home. Teachers had written her off as a troublemaker when she acted out in class, not understanding that hunger and exhaustion made it hard to concentrate. But the Johnsons had seen something different. They adopted her when she was 15, giving her stability for the first time in her life. Under their care, she had flourished. She graduated high school with honors, earned a nursing degree, and had just started working in the pediatric ward at St. Mary's Hospital. She loved caring for sick children, understanding their fear and pain in ways that her colleagues couldn't. Now she was the patient, trapped in a bed that felt like a prison. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent years learning to heal others, and now she needed to learn how to heal herself. The difference was that this time, the healing wasn't just physical. It was a battle for her identity, her future, her very sense of who she was. The midnight shift nurse, an older woman named Gloria, checked on her more frequently than the others. Gloria had kind eyes and gentle hands, and she never rushed through her duties. When Sarah couldn't sleep, Gloria would sit beside her bed and talk about her own children, her garden, the books she was reading. These conversations became lifelines in the dark hours. "You remind me of my daughter," Gloria said one night as she adjusted Sarah's pillows. "She's stubborn like you. Won't take no for an answer about anything." Sarah managed a weak smile. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing? In your case, honey, it's going to save your life." The words settled into Sarah's chest like warm honey. She thought about all the times people had called her stubborn, as if it were a character flaw. Her teachers, her caseworkers, even some of her foster families had tried to break that stubbornness to make her more compliant and easier to manage. But the Johnsons had encouraged it, channeling it into determination and goal setting. As the night wore on, Sarah found herself making mental lists, things she would do when she got out of this bed, places she wanted to visit, skills she wanted to learn. The doctors talked about limitations, but Sarah focused on possibilities. She had read about people who had overcome similar injuries, athletes who had returned to competition, artists who had found new ways to create. The pain was constant now, a low thrum that colored every thought and sensation. But pain had been her companion before. The emotional pain of abandonment, the physical pain of going to bed hungry, the deep ache of feeling unwanted and unworthy. She had survived all of that and found ways to transform it into strength. At 3 a.m., when the hospital was at its quietest, Sarah made a decision. She would not just survive this injury, she would use it as a launching pad for something greater. She didn't know what that meant yet, but she felt it in her bones, in the part of her that had never learned to surrender. The clock continued its relentless march forward. 3:01, 3:02, 3:03. Each minute was a choice to keep fighting, to keep believing that tomorrow could be different from today. Sarah closed her eyes and began to plan. Recovery would be her full-time job now, and she intended to approach it with the same dedication she had brought to everything else in her life. Outside her window, the city slept. Traffic lights blinked red and green for empty streets. The world continued its rotation, indifferent to the small drama playing out in room 314. But inside that room, something significant was taking shape. A quiet revolution was beginning, one tick of the clock at a time. The rehabilitation center smelled like disinfectant and determination. Sarah had been transferred there after 6 weeks in the hospital, and the change of scenery felt like emerging from a cave into daylight. The walls were painted in cheerful colors, and motivational posters hung everywhere, showing people in wheelchairs climbing mountains and swimming in pools. Her new room was smaller but brighter, with a window that looked out onto a garden where other patients practiced walking between parallel bars. Sarah watched them for hours, studying their movements, their expressions, their small victories and frustrations. Some moved with confidence, others took tentative steps like newborn deer. All of them were fighting the same battle she was about to begin. Dr. Martinez, her new physician, was different from the doctors at the hospital. He didn't speak in medical jargon or hedge his predictions with careful disclaimers. When he examined her legs and tested her reflexes, his face showed genuine optimism. "You have good muscle tone for someone who's been bedridden," he said, making notes on his tablet. "The feeling in your legs is stronger than your initial reports suggested. I think we can work with this." Physical therapy began immediately. Sarah's therapist was a woman named Rebecca, who had the build of a former athlete and the personality of a drill sergeant wrapped in compassion. Rebecca didn't believe in false encouragement or sugarcoating reality. She told Sarah exactly what the next months would demand from her. "Recovery isn't a straight line," Rebecca explained, as she helped Sarah transfer from her bed to a wheelchair for the first time. "Some days you'll feel like you're making progress. Other days you'll feel like you're going backward. The key is showing up regardless of how you feel." The first attempts at movement were humiliating. Simple tasks that Sarah had never thought about. Shifting her weight, maintaining balance, coordinating her muscles, required enormous effort and concentration. Sweat poured down her face as she struggled to lift her leg just a few inches off the therapy table. Her body felt foreign, disconnected, like she was operating a machine she didn't understand. Other patients in the therapy room worked around her, each fighting their own battles. There was Marcus, a construction worker who had fallen from scaffolding and lost the use of his right arm. He spent hours learning to write with his left hand, filling notebook after notebook with shaky letters. Jennifer was a soccer mom who had suffered a stroke at 35. She relearned how to speak, starting with simple words and building toward full sentences. Sarah found inspiration in their determination. During group sessions, they shared their frustrations and breakthroughs. Marcus talked about the day he successfully tied his shoes with one hand. Jennifer celebrated the moment she could say her children's names clearly again. These small victories felt monumental in the context of their struggles. The clock in the therapy room became Sarah's focus during the hardest exercises. When Rebecca asked her to stand between parallel bars for 30 seconds, Sarah fixed her, eyes on the second hand, and counted. 29, 30, 31. Each extra second was a rebellion against her body's limitations. Nights were still the hardest time. The rehabilitation center was quieter than the hospital, but sleep remained elusive. Sarah's mind raced with questions about her future. Would she be able to return to nursing? Could she live independently? Would anyone want to build a relationship with someone who might never walk normally again? She began keeping a journal, writing down her thoughts and goals. The act of forming words on paper felt like creating order from chaos. She wrote about her pain, both physical and emotional. She wrote about her fears and her hopes. Most importantly, she wrote about her determination to prove everyone wrong who had ever doubted her. Maya visited every few days, bringing news from the outside world. The pediatric ward at St. Mary's missed her, Maya reported. The children asked about their favorite nurse and when she would come back to read them stories. These updates filled Sarah with purpose. She had people counting on her return. The Johnsons came every evening after work, sometimes bringing dinner from Sarah's favorite restaurant. They talked about ordinary things, neighborhood gossip, TV shows, plans for their garden. These conversations felt like anchors to her old life, reminders that she was more than her injury. Physical therapy sessions became longer and more challenging. Rebecca introduced new equipment, resistance bands, weight machines adapted for wheelchair users, balance balls that terrified and excited Sarah in equal measure. Each piece of equipment represented a new frontier to conquer. The breakthrough came during her 4th week at the rehabilitation center. Sarah was working on a standing exercise using the parallel bars to support her weight when she felt something different in her left leg. Not pain or numbness, but sensation. Real, clear, feeling that traveled from her hip to her ankle. "Rebecca," she called out, her voice shaking with excitement. "Something's happening." Rebecca hurried over, her professional demeanor cracking to reveal genuine excitement. "What are you feeling?" "My left leg. It's like it's waking up." Rebecca guided Sarah through a series of tests, checking reflexes and responses. The improvements were small but unmistakable. Feeling was returning to areas that had been numb since the accident. It wasn't a miracle cure, but it was progress. That night, Sarah lay in bed staring at the clock with different eyes. The minutes still passed slowly, but now each tick represented potential rather than just endurance. Her body was healing in ways the doctors hadn't predicted. The combination of her determination and her youth was creating possibilities that medical textbooks said were unlikely. She began to understand that recovery wasn't just about regaining what she had lost. It was about discovering what she was capable of becoming. The accident had taken away her old life, but it was also revealing strengths she never knew she possessed. Every small improvement felt like a victory against fate itself. The clock showed 2:47 a.m. when Sarah finally drifted off to sleep, dreaming of walking through the hospital corridors in her white nursing shoes, returning to the children who needed her care. 3 months into rehabilitation, Sarah faced her first major setback. She had been making steady progress, gaining strength and sensation in both legs, when a routine therapy session went wrong. While practicing transfers from her wheelchair to a mat, she lost her balance and fell, landing hard on her right side. The impact sent shockwaves through her healing spine and reopened old wounds in her psyche. Dr. Martinez ordered new scans, and the results showed minor inflammation around her spinal cord. Nothing permanent, he assured her, but enough to require a temporary reduction in physical activity. For someone who had been measuring progress in daily increments, this forced pause felt like a devastating blow. Sarah spent 3 days in bed, staring at the ceiling and questioning everything. The dark thoughts that she had kept at bay through sheer determination came flooding back. Maybe the doctors had been right from the beginning. Maybe she was fooling herself with impossible dreams. Maybe acceptance of her limitations was more realistic than fighting against them. The clock on her nightstand seemed to mock her with its steady progression. Hours crawled by without purpose or hope. She declined visits from Maya, and even asked the Johnsons to stay home for a few days. The isolation felt appropriate for her mood. Dark, heavy, and seemingly endless. It was Marcus who broke through, her despair. The construction worker knocked on her door on the 4th day of her retreat from the world. He wheeled himself into her room without permission and positioned his chair directly beside her bed. "You look like hell," he said without preamble. "Thanks for the pep talk," Sarah replied, not bothering to hide her sarcasm. "I'm not here to blow sunshine up your ass," Marcus continued. "I'm here because I did exactly what you're doing right now. Gave up for a while, felt sorry for myself. Decided that everyone else was right and I was just kidding myself about getting better." Sarah turned to look at him properly for the first time since he'd entered. Marcus had been at the center for 2 months longer than her, and she had watched. His transformation from angry and defeated to focused and determined. His right arm still hung useless at his side, but his left arm had developed impressive strength and dexterity. "What changed?" she asked. "My 8-year-old daughter came to visit. She drew me a picture of us playing catch in the backyard. In her drawing, I was throwing the ball with my left hand, and she didn't even seem to think that was weird or sad. She just drew what she imagined was possible." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Sarah the drawing. It was done in crayon, on construction paper, the kind of artwork that usually ended up on refrigerators. But in that simple image, Sarah saw something profound. The uncompromising faith of a child who believed her father could overcome anything. "Kids don't know what's impossible," Marcus said. "Maybe we shouldn't either." That conversation planted a seed that grew over the following days. Sarah began to pay attention to the children who visited other patients. They played games in the common areas, their laughter echoing through hallways designed for serious medical business. They saw wheelchairs as interesting vehicles rather than symbols of loss. They asked direct questions about scars and equipment, without the awkward dance of adult politeness. Sarah remembered why she had become a pediatric nurse in the first place. Children faced illness and injury with a resilience that humbled her. They cried when things hurt, celebrated small improvements, and approached each day with curiosity about what might be possible. Somewhere in her adult determination to be strong, she had forgotten the power of that childlike openness to wonder. Rebecca noticed the change when Sarah returned to physical therapy. There was a lightness in her approach that hadn't been there before, a willingness to try new things, without the grim intensity that had characterized her earlier efforts. When she struggled with an exercise, she laughed instead of gritting her teeth in frustration. "What's different?" Rebecca asked during a session focused on standing balance. "I stopped trying to be perfect," Sarah said, wobbling slightly as she held herself upright between the parallel bars. "I'm just trying to be better than yesterday." This shift in perspective opened new possibilities in her training. Instead of measuring success only in terms of walking normally again, Sarah began to appreciate smaller improvements. The day she could stand for 5 minutes without assistance, the morning she transferred from bed to wheelchair without help, the afternoon she wheeled herself to the garden and felt sunshine on her face for the first time since the accident. Physical improvements accelerated when she stopped fighting her circumstances and started working with them. Feeling continued to return to her legs, accompanied by the ability to move her feet and flex her ankles. Dr. Martinez was cautiously optimistic about her progress, but Sarah had moved beyond needing his approval. She knew her body better than any medical chart could capture. The other patients became her extended family. Jennifer taught her card games that they played in the evening recreation room. Marcus showed her exercises he had developed for building core strength. An older man named William, who was recovering from a stroke, shared stories about his career as a pilot, teaching Sarah that setbacks were just temporary course corrections. Sarah's journal entries became more detailed and hopeful. She wrote about her goals, both immediate and long-term. She wanted to walk unassisted, return to nursing, and someday help other people navigate their own recovery journeys. The accident had taken away her old life, but it was also revealing new possibilities she had never considered. Late one evening, as Sarah practiced wheelchair navigation through an obstacle course in the therapy room, she realized that the clock no longer felt like an enemy. Time was still slow, but it was filled with purpose now. Each hour represented another opportunity to grow stronger, to learn something new about her body's capabilities, to connect with someone else who understood the journey. The night nurse found her there at midnight, still practicing turns around orange cones. "Shouldn't you be sleeping?" the nurse asked. Sarah smiled, feeling sweat on her forehead and strength in her arms that hadn't been there months ago. "I'll sleep when I'm tired. Right now I'm too busy getting my life back." The clock on the therapy room wall showed 12:03 a.m. as Sarah completed another lap around the course. Each revolution was a declaration that she refused to be defined by what had happened to her. She was writing a new story, one determined minute at a time. 6 months after the accident, Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror at the rehabilitation center, gripping the sink for support. Her legs shook with the effort, but they held her weight. The reflection staring back at her showed someone she barely recognized, thinner, marked by scars, but with eyes that burned with fierce determination. Walking remained a struggle that required intense concentration and specialized equipment. She used forearm crutches now, metal supports that had become extensions of her body. Each step was deliberate and careful, but it was progress that the doctors had said might never come. The feeling in her legs had returned almost completely, though weakness and pain remained constant companions. Rebecca had prepared her for this transition back to semi-independent living. They had practiced everything from cooking simple meals while seated to navigating stairs with crutches. The rehabilitation center had become Sarah's world for so long that the prospect of leaving felt both exciting and terrifying. The Johnsons had modified their home to accommodate her needs. Ramps replaced steps, grab bars lined the hallways, and her old bedroom had been moved to the ground floor. They showed her photos of the changes with pride, as if they were unveiling a palace instead of accessibility modifications. "We want you to be comfortable," her adoptive mother Linda said during one of their planning sessions. "But we also don't want you to feel like an invalid. You're still our daughter, just with some new equipment." Sarah appreciated their efforts, but she had been thinking about independence in broader terms. Living with the Johnsons again felt like moving backward, even though she knew it was the practical choice for now. She had tasted adult independence before the accident, her own apartment, her career, the ability to go anywhere and do anything on a whim. Those freedoms seemed precious now that they had been taken away. The discharge planning meetings involved a parade of specialists. Occupational therapists discussed adaptive equipment for daily living. Social workers talked about disability benefits and support services. Vocational counselors explored options for returning to work, though nursing seemed impossible given the physical demands of the job. Sarah listened to their recommendations but made her own plans. She had been researching online, connecting with support groups, and learning about other healthcare professionals who had overcome similar challenges. She discovered nurses who worked in administrative roles, counselors who specialized in trauma, recovery, and advocates who fought for disability rights. Her first day back in the outside world was overwhelming. The car ride to the Johnsons' house, a journey that had once taken 20 minutes, felt like traveling to another planet. Traffic noise seemed louder, colors more intense, and the simple act of being in motion without controlling her movement made her anxious. The house looked exactly the same, but Sarah experienced it differently. Doorways seemed narrower when approached with crutches. The stairs to the second floor might as well have been Mount Everest. Even simple tasks like making coffee required careful planning and energy conservation. But there were unexpected joys, too. Sleeping in a real bed instead of a hospital mattress felt luxurious. The Johnsons' cat, a fat orange tabby named Chester, seemed to understand that Sarah needed extra attention and appointed himself as her constant companion. The familiar sounds of a real home, the refrigerator humming, the heater clicking on, the neighbors' dogs barking, were a symphony after months of medical equipment beeps and hospital announcements. Maya threw a small welcome home party, inviting a few close friends who had visited during Sarah's hospitalization. The gathering was intentionally low-key, but Sarah found herself exhausted after just 2 hours of conversation. Her energy reserves were smaller now, and she had to ration her social interactions carefully. The hardest adjustment was the change in how people treated her. Friends and acquaintances spoke more slowly, offered help with everything, and seemed surprised when she displayed her usual sense of humor. She could see them searching for the person she used to be, trying to reconcile the Sarah they remembered with the woman who now used crutches and moved carefully through the world. Some relationships couldn't survive the change. A few friends gradually stopped calling, unable to navigate the new dynamic. Sarah's ex-boyfriend, David, visited once and left early, clearly uncomfortable with her physical limitations. These losses stung, but they also clarified who truly cared about her beyond her former abilities. Sleep came easier at home, but the early morning hours remained challenging. Sarah would wake at 4 a.m., her body trained by months of hospital schedules, and lie in the darkness listening to the house settle around her. The clock beside her bed glowed softly, marking time in a space that felt both familiar and foreign. During these quiet hours, she planned her next moves. Returning to nursing might be impossible in the traditional sense, but her experience as a patient had given her insights that could be valuable in other ways. She had seen gaps in the healthcare system, moments when patients needed advocates, and emotional support that busy medical staff couldn't provide. Sarah began researching graduate programs in healthcare administration and patient advocacy. The applications required essays about her goals and qualifications, and she found herself writing about her accident, not as a tragedy, but as education that had prepared her for a different kind of service. Physical therapy continued at an outpatient clinic. The sessions were less intensive but more focused on real-world applications. Sarah practiced navigating curbs, opening heavy doors, and managing her equipment in crowded spaces. Each skill mastered was another step toward independence. The breakthrough moment came during a therapy session in the clinic's mock apartment. Sarah was practicing cooking while standing with her crutches when she realized she wasn't thinking about her movements anymore. Her body had learned to compensate for its limitations, developing new patterns of balance and coordination. She was adapting rather than just surviving. "Look at you," Rebecca said, watching Sarah flip pancakes with casual confidence. "6 months ago you couldn't lift your leg off a table." Sarah smiled, feeling genuine pride for the first time since the accident. "6 months ago, I thought recovery meant getting back everything I lost. Now I know it means becoming someone new." The clock on the kitchen wall showed 3:30 p.m., but Sarah wasn't watching it anymore. Time had become a tool rather than a burden, something she could use to measure progress rather than endure passively. She was learning to live in her new body, to find joy in adapted activities, and to believe that her future could be different from her past but equally valuable. That evening, she called the nursing program coordinator at the local university to discuss their healthcare administration master's degree. It was time to stop waiting for her old life to return and start building something entirely new. 1 year after the accident, Sarah walked across the stage at the university auditorium to accept her acceptance letter into the Master of Healthcare Administration program. She still used forearm crutches, but her movement was fluid and confident. The applause from the small ceremony felt like thunder in her chest. The university had been more accommodating than she expected. When she called to inquire about the program, the admissions coordinator immediately began discussing disability services and adaptive technologies rather than questioning whether she could handle the coursework. Her essay about using her patient experience to improve healthcare systems had impressed the review committee. But starting graduate school meant leaving the safety of the rehabilitation center and the Johnsons' home. Sarah had found a small apartment near campus, modified with the accessibility features she needed. The space was tiny compared to her old place, but it represented something enormous: her return to independent living. Moving day was emotional for everyone. Linda Johnson cried as she helped Sarah arrange kitchen items in lower cabinets. Her adoptive father, Robert, installed additional grab bars in the bathroom and tested the wheelchair ramp 3 times to ensure it was secure. They were proud of her progress but worried about her living alone. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," Linda said as they sat in Sarah's new living room surrounded by boxes. "We love you exactly as you are." Sarah hugged her adoptive mother, feeling the truth of those words. The Johnsons had loved her unconditionally from the moment they met her as an angry teenager. They had celebrated her nursing school graduation with the same enthusiasm they would have shown for a biological child. Their support had been constant through every phase of her recovery. "I know you love me," Sarah said, "but I need to love myself too, and I can only do that by seeing what I'm capable of." The first weeks of living alone were challenging in ways she hadn't anticipated. Simple tasks like grocery shopping required careful planning and significant energy. She had to learn new routes to campus that avoided stairs and steep inclines. Some days, the physical demands of independent living left her too exhausted for studying. But there were victories too. The first morning she woke up in her own bed, made her own coffee, and sat at her own kitchen table reading assignments for her healthcare policy class felt like a personal revolution. She was no longer a patient or a victim or someone who needed constant care. She was a graduate student with goals and ambitions that extended far beyond her physical limitations. Her classmates were initially unsure how to interact with her. Most were young professionals in their 20s and 30s, people who had never faced serious health challenges. Sarah's presence in their discussions about healthcare systems brought a perspective that textbooks couldn't provide. When they debated patient satisfaction scores, she could speak from experience about what actually mattered to people in hospital beds. Professor Williams, who taught healthcare economics, quickly recognized Sarah's unique contributions to class discussions. Her insights about the gaps between medical treatment and patient experience added depth to academic theories. When the class studied rehabilitation services funding, Sarah presented data from her own recovery journey, showing how insurance limitations affected treatment decisions. The coursework was demanding but engaging. Sarah dove into research about healthcare accessibility, studying systems in other countries and innovative programs that served disabled populations. She discovered a passion for policy analysis that surprised her. The same attention to detail that had made her a good nurse translated perfectly to analyzing healthcare legislation and institutional practices. Physical therapy continued 3 times a week at a clinic near campus. Her goals had evolved from basic mobility to optimizing her function for her new lifestyle. She worked on stamina for long days in classrooms, upper body strength for manipulating heavy textbooks, and balance techniques for navigating crowded campus walkways. The therapy sessions were no longer about recovery from trauma, but about preparation for the future she was building. Sarah had stopped comparing her current abilities to what she could do before the accident. Instead, she measured progress against her evolving goals and dreams. Romance seemed like a distant possibility until she met Alex in her healthcare information systems class. He was a nurse practitioner returning to school to specialize in electronic medical records implementation. Their first conversation was about database design and patient privacy protocols, topics that most people would find mind-numbingly boring, but that sparked genuine excitement in both of them. Alex treated her disability matter-of-factly, neither ignoring it nor making it the central focus of their interactions. When they studied together at the library, he would choose tables that were wheelchair accessible without making a big production of his consideration. When they walked to coffee shops, he matched her pace naturally and carried her books without being asked. Their relationship developed slowly, built on shared interests and mutual respect rather than physical attraction alone. Sarah had worried that her changed body would make romantic relationships impossible, but Alex seemed to see her wholeness rather than her limitations. Their first kiss happened in the university library while they were reviewing notes about healthcare quality metrics surrounded by towering stacks of research books. The anniversary of her accident arrived without fanfare. Sarah marked the date by visiting the rehabilitation center, bringing cookies for the staff who had helped her rebuild her life. Rebecca gave her a tour of the facility, showing her new equipment and introducing her to current patients who were fighting battles similar to her own. "You should come speak to our patients," Rebecca suggested. Seeing someone who's made it through the program and built a new life would mean a lot to them. Sarah agreed immediately. She understood the power of seeing possibility embodied in another person. When she had been bedridden and hopeless, watching other patients achieve small victories had kept her going. Now she could be that example for someone else. Her first speaking engagement was informal, just sitting in the common room with current patients and sharing her story. She talked about the depression that had nearly derailed her recovery, the setbacks that had felt like failures, and the gradual realization that healing wasn't about returning to her old self, but about discovering who she could become. A young man named David, newly injured in a motorcycle accident, asked the question that everyone was thinking: do you ever wish the accident hadn't happened? Sarah considered her answer carefully. The question touched the deepest part of her journey, the place where pain and growth intersected. I wish I hadn't suffered, she said finally. I wish I hadn't spent months in agony and fear. But the accident led me to discover strengths I never knew I had. It changed my career path toward something that feels more meaningful. It taught me what really matters in relationships and friendships. So no, I can't honestly say I wish it hadn't happened. The clock on the common room wall showed 8:45 p.m. when Sarah finally left the rehabilitation center. She drove herself home, using hand controls that had become second nature. In her apartment, she spread her textbooks across her kitchen table and began working on a research paper about trauma-informed care in rehabilitation settings. As she typed, Sarah realized that her relationship with time had fundamentally changed. The clock still measured minutes and hours, but they no longer felt like obstacles to endure. They were resources to invest, opportunities to build the life she was choosing, rather than accepting the limitations others had predicted for her. 2 years after graduation, Sarah stood before the hospital board of directors, presenting her proposal for a new patient advocacy program. The conference room was intimidating: mahogany table, leather chairs, and portraits of distinguished physicians lining the walls. But Sarah felt calm as she clicked through her presentation slides, supported by 2 years of research and real-world experience. She had completed her master's degree with highest honors, writing her thesis on patient-centered care models in rehabilitation settings. The research had combined her personal experience with rigorous academic analysis, creating recommendations that several hospitals had already begun implementing. Her professors had encouraged her to pursue doctoral studies, but Sarah was eager to start making changes in the real world. The job search had been challenging. Many healthcare organizations expressed interest in her qualifications, but seemed nervous about accommodating her disability. Some interviews felt more like assessments of her physical limitations than evaluations of her professional capabilities. Sarah learned to address these concerns directly, demonstrating her competence while refusing to apologize for her adaptive equipment. St. Mary's Hospital, where she had worked as a nurse before the accident, offered her a position as patient experience coordinator. The role involved investigating complaints, mediating between patients and staff, and developing programs to improve care quality. It wasn't the bedside nursing she had originally planned, but it was meaningful work that utilized all of her skills and experience. Her office was located in the administrative wing, but Sarah spent most of her time throughout the hospital. She rolled through corridors she had once walked, greeting former colleagues and meeting new staff members. Some of her old nursing friends were initially awkward around her, unsure how to reconcile the Sarah they remembered with the woman who now navigated the world differently. The pediatric ward welcomed her back like a returning hero. The children she had cared for before the accident were mostly gone, replaced by new young patients fighting their own battles. But the remaining staff remembered her warmth and dedication. They quickly discovered that her experience as a patient had made her an even better advocate for the children and families they served. Sarah's first major project involved redesigning the discharge process for long-term patients. She had experienced firsthand how overwhelming the transition from hospital to home could be, how critical information got lost in translation between medical teams and patients. Working with nurses, doctors, and social workers, she developed a comprehensive program that included follow-up calls, resource packets, and peer support connections. The program's success led to additional responsibilities. Sarah began conducting training sessions for staff about patient perspective and empathy. She shared her story not as inspiration, but as education, helping healthcare workers understand the emotional journey that accompanied physical healing. These sessions were always standing room only, with staff members staying after their shifts to participate. Alex had finished his own graduate program and taken a position implementing electronic health records at a nearby medical center. Their relationship had deepened through shared professional interests and mutual support during stressful academic periods. He proposed to Sarah in the hospital cafeteria, where they had first discussed healthcare data analytics as students, presenting the ring alongside a research paper they had co-authored about patient communication systems. Planning their wedding involved considerations that most couples never faced. The venue needed to be wheelchair accessible for several guests who were Sarah's friends from the rehabilitation center. The ceremony was designed to accommodate her energy limitations while still celebrating in style. Sarah wore a dress that looked elegant whether she was standing with her crutches or seated in her wheelchair. Marcus served as one of her groomsmen, having become like a brother through their shared recovery journey. Jennifer, the stroke survivor, gave a reading about resilience and transformation. The rehabilitation center staff attended as honored guests, having played crucial roles in making this celebration possible. During her speech at the reception, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 years ago, I measured time by how long I could endure pain, she said, looking around the room at faces that had supported her through the darkest period of her life. Tonight, I measure it by how much joy I can pack into each moment. The hospital board had approved her patient advocacy program proposal unanimously. The initiative would start small, focusing on patients with extended stays and complex discharge needs, but Sarah envisioned expanding it throughout the healthcare system. She had already received inquiries from other hospitals interested in implementing similar programs. Her workdays were full but fulfilling. Sarah spent mornings reviewing patient complaints and conducting interviews with families about their hospital experiences. Afternoons were devoted to working with medical teams to address systemic issues and improve care protocols. She had learned to pace herself, taking breaks when her body demanded rest, but her energy for the work seemed inexhaustible. The pediatric unit had become her special focus. Children adapted to illness and injury with a resilience that continuously amazed her, but their families often struggled with fear and confusion about medical procedures and prognoses. Sarah developed support groups for parents, educational materials written in plain language, and play therapy programs that helped young patients process their experiences. One evening, while finishing paperwork in her office, Sarah received a call from the rehabilitation center. A new patient, a woman injured in a construction accident, was refusing to participate in physical therapy. She had given up hope and was talking about wanting to die rather than live with disability. "Would you be willing to visit?" Rebecca asked. Sometimes hearing from someone who's been through it makes all the difference. Sarah drove to the rehabilitation center that night, navigating streets that had once seemed impossible to manage independently. She found the patient, Maria, lying in bed staring at the ceiling with the same expression Sarah remembered wearing during her own darkest days. "I'm not here to tell you everything will be fine," Sarah said, pulling her wheelchair close to Maria's bed. "I'm here to tell you that you have choices even when it feels like you don't." They talked for 2 hours. Sarah shared the brutal honesty of her own journey, the despair, the setbacks, the slow rebuilding of hope and purpose. She didn't minimize Maria's pain or rush to offer solutions. Instead, she listened and provided the presence of someone who truly understood. Before leaving, Sarah gave Maria her phone number. "Call me when you're ready to try again," she said. "Or call me when you're not ready but need someone to talk to. Recovery doesn't happen on a schedule." Driving home through the quiet city streets, Sarah reflected on how far she had traveled from that first night in the hospital, when each minute felt like an eternity. The clock on her dashboard showed 11:20 p.m., but she wasn't counting minutes anymore. She was living them, filling them with purpose and connection and the knowledge that her suffering had been transformed into service. At home, Alex was waiting with tea and questions about her day. They sat together on their adapted couch, Chester, the cat purring between them, and Sarah told him about Maria and the familiar darkness she had seen in another person's eyes. "Do you think she'll call?" Alex asked. Sarah smiled, remembering her own journey from despair to determination. Eventually, everyone finds their own timeline for healing. Mine just happened to start with learning that endurance was only the beginning, not the end goal. The clock on their mantel chimed midnight, marking the end of another day in the life Sarah had built from the ashes of her old existence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help other people navigate their own difficult journeys. Time was no longer something to survive, but something to invest wisely in the work that gave her life meaning. She had learned that true strength wasn't about never falling down. It was about getting back up, adapting to new circumstances, and using every experience, even the painful ones, to become more compassionate and effective in serving others. The accident had ended one chapter of her life, but it had also begun a story that was richer and more purposeful than anything she could have imagined before. As Sarah prepared for bed, checking that her crutches were within easy reach and setting her alarm for another full day ahead, she realized that she had stopped watching clocks and started living in the time they measured. The hours no longer dragged. They flew by, filled with work that mattered and relationships that sustained her. The broken woman who had once counted ceiling tiles in a hospital room had become someone who helped others discover their own capacity for healing and growth. Her will had remained unbroken through 12 of the hardest hours of her life, and that same determination now powered a career dedicated to ensuring that other patients would never feel as alone or hopeless as she once had.